So, I'm going to talk about chapter 15, which is Manifest Destiny. So, Manifest Destiny was this inherent idea that the United States, or America, as this new nation, was given this right by God from birth to expand its borders all the way west from sea to sea. So they used this to acquire pretty much all of the current United States territory, and it makes up even what most of our identity is nowadays. So one of the men who kind of made this term really popular was John O'Sullivan, who was a New York publisher, newspaper writer. So one of the first territories to kind of fall under this idea of manifest destiny was under President Thomas Jefferson's rule. America began to look at this largely uncharted territory of Louisiana. So one of the key places in Louisiana was New Orleans. It specifically on the coast had a trade port that farmers would often use to ship goods in and out of. And so the territory of Louisiana at the time stretched all the way from Canada to Texas, down to Texas, and then westward to the Rocky Mountains. So, however, even though originally this was territory owned by the French, it was then taken over by Spain, but then the ruler of France at the time of Jefferson's presidency, Napoleon Bonaparte, raised the alarm of local farmers that used the port of New Orleans because he convinced Spain to give it back to him. And so he had plans for Louisiana in that he planned to send over a bunch of French farmers and use the ports to ship food to his slaves in the Caribbeans, which was then owned by the French. However, shortly after, there was a slave rebellion that led to a deal struck between Napoleon and Jefferson called the Noble Bargain, where essentially the United States agreed to pay for that territory because Napoleon no longer had use for it since the slaves had rebelled and that the French had lost control. And then in addition, there was tensions rising between the French and the British, which Napoleon knew was going to lead to war soon, and so he feared possibly losing the territory anyways to the British, so he figured selling it to America would be better. However, arguments quickly arose for numerous reasons, some of which were like that the price tag was too high, some of which was that the territory would be too much because it would double the size of the current American territory and it would be hard to govern, so stuff like that. However, even though Jefferson was concerned over the concept that it kind of was overstepping a constitution that he had earlier helped to create, he figured it was too historic of an opportunity to pass up. Moving on to Florida. So, after Louisiana was purchased through diplomacy, America then set its sights on the peninsula of Florida. They initially tried attempts at diplomacy, though those attempts failed. Most of America at the time didn't really see a point in getting Florida since it was such a small territory. However, slaves would send raiding parties from Florida into Georgia and raid crops and stuff in Georgia. So the Georgian people at the time were pretty focused on trying to get this Florida territory conquered. This is where Andrew Jackson comes in. He specifically had orders to maintain peace, but in Georgia, however, instead he ended up taking his troops, marching right into Florida, and ended up getting some victories. And this led to Jackson's telling of the people who currently own Florida to govern or get out. And because of this defeat, a deal was eventually reached for Florida where America was able to claim Florida. Then came Texas. So Texas was sought after by the United States because it had cotton crops, which were considered cash crops at the time. So many Americans really wanted to set up in Texas. However, it was closed off by Mexico to the United States at the time. However, they eventually let somebody in by the name of Moses Austin, who then later, his son took over, Stephen Austin, when Moses passed away. Mexico had agreed to let a few Americans in, and Texas had gained its independence around this time. However, as people were allowed in, there was this term Tejano used, which stood for the Mexicans who were in Texas versus the Americans who had moved into Texas. And it eventually became that there were so many Americans moving into Texas because of the cash crop opportunity, more than they had agreed to, that tensions began to grow as American settlers had begun to resent the Tejanos that were living there. One such person who was kind of a huge voice for the Texas being annexed by America was this man by the name of William Travis. However, not everybody quite agreed with him. There was another man, general of the Mexican army, named Santa Anna, who led Mexican troops into Texas to kind of quell this revolution talks. However, this led to the Battle of the Alamo, which a bunch of American Texas natives kind of held up in a small little area. And so, in rage, Santa Anna declared that there would be no mercy shown to these Americans. And so, their overwhelming force eventually overwhelmed the Americans. However, it took them a couple of days. And so some of the people who were among these Americans were Davy Crockett, James Bowie, and William Travis, who I mentioned earlier. And so, once again, Santa Anna declared no mercy, so everybody that was at the Alamo was shot down. However, this led to a new sense that Texas should be annexed. The Americans in Texas then used that as a battle cry to fight for new independence from complete independence from the Mexican government to make it an independent state altogether. And they used the battle cry of "Remember the Alamo." So they marched into where the Mexican soldiers were, and they starved them out. They also led a surprise attack on the Mexican soldiers, because the Mexican soldiers believed that they would attack and they waited until nightfall and then attacked instead, which the Mexican soldiers weren't ready for. So at the time, President Polk had became the President of the United States, and he eventually was able to win in the vote to annex Texas, despite the fact that that could cause a war with between America and Mexico. Now, Oregon, which is up north, kind of northwest, there was a four-way claim for it. There was 4 different countries that had laid claim to it. So that was French, Britain, America, and Spain. Now, eventually, most of them dropped out, all except Britain and the United States. There was 2 explorers by the name of Lewis and Clark, who, with the help of a Native American by the name of Sacagawea, set out to chart a course from the east coast to the west coast. However, the problem is that even though they were able to chart out the course and the territory between east coast and west coast, is that the course that they took was really dangerous and went over many rocky mountains. However, there was a fur trapper by the name of Jedediah Smith who was later able to find a safer route to Oregon, which was on a much flatter road, which led to more people coming. At first, it was mostly missionaries that went to Oregon, but then as Oregon fever hit, many more settlers started to come, especially with Jedediah Smith's new path to get there. So part of what Oregon fever was because the first settlers that went there sent word back that the land was really beautiful, that there was no disease to be heard of there, and that food was in such abundance that he literally made a joke about the fact that there's pigs run around already cooked with forks and knives sticking in them, so you could just cut you off a slice of pork whenever you want it, as to how nice the living was over there. But once again, at this point, Britain and the U.S. still laid claim to Oregon. So President Polk eventually was able to convince Britain. They were able to come to an agreement that Oregon would be divided along the 49th parallel. Now, this wasn't the most popular thing, but it did save from more blood being shed, and still stands today as the border between Canada and the United States. So the last part in terms of this concept of manifest destiny and acquiring territory to make America what it is currently was the Mexico-American War. So this started over first Texas, when the U.S. annexed Texas. Then it became a dispute about where the border would be, whether it would be the Rio Grande, which is what the United States wanted it to be, or the Nueces River, which is what Mexico wanted it to be. So eventually war broke out because some Americans were patrolling along the Rio Grande, which was the American border, or America's idea of a border, and they were shot by Mexican troops as invaders. So Americans saw this as an act of war. Polk got what he wanted, which was war with Mexico to claim more land, and the Mexican government was saying that there was greedy Americans who were invading their territory. So the two sides fought. So the fight for New Mexico and that area was manned by Stephen Kearny. And so once pretty much that area had been taken over. There was another man by the name of John Fremont who fought for California against a general by the name of Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. So America won both these kind of lands relatively easy. However, the fiercest part of the battle came when General Kearny led troops into Mexico. He was able to eventually win both sides. The battle was described as being pretty bloody and losing a lot of troops on both sides. However, it eventually ended in American victory, first over northern Mexico, then with some more bloody battling. Eventually, the capital was able to be taken by General Kearny. So this led to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where there was a Mexican cession, which basically a cession means to give something up completely, in which case the following territories were claimed: California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. To some people, both sides, it was a joke. Some believed that we didn't need any more territory. Some believed that the territory that we were getting wasn't worth anything, because essentially America agreed to pay $15,000 and to protect the Mexican citizens living there at the time. However, that proved to not be true. Other people believed it was a joke because they didn't think that America should have gone to war in the first place. But to other people, it was a dream come true, because it was this idea of manifest destiny, that it was God's divine given right to conquer this territory, for them to get all this land. This also led to the Gadsden Purchase, eventually, where America was able to then buy even more land from Mexico. So to some, this was kind of the ugly side of the whole concept of manifest destiny, because a lot of people up until that point still believed that America was really righteous and good, and that it wouldn't never commit such acts as bullying people into other countries into giving them territory. However, the Mexican-American War proved that they would do just that, or whatever it took to get this territory. So that is manifest destiny. Of course, once again, there's some stuff that I didn't mention, so you need to get that from the book in chapter 15.